The subcommittee will come to order. Today, the subcommittee will consider the steps that Congress can take to facilitate the creation of a nationwide interoperable broadband network for the public safety community. As the terrorist attacks on 9/11 and the natural disasters such as Hurricane Katrina have starkly revealed, there are serious obstacles that prevent fire, police, and rescue personnel from one locality from communicating with first responders from other localities when they converge on the scene of a disaster. In some instances, fire, police, and rescue personnel in a single locality may lack a means of interoperable communications one with another. There is a widely understood need to create a fully interoperable first responder network, but as of today, that network remains a goal. It is not a reality. On a bipartisan basis, the members of this committee are determined to address this challenge and take the steps that are necessary from a legislative perspective in order to make that first responder network a reality. In bipartisan cooperation, our staffs have assembled a discussion draft of legislation that spells out those necessary steps. Our focus this morning is on that discussion draft. The largest single challenge to creating the first responder network is identifying and obtaining the funding that is needed for the buying, the installation, the operating, and the maintaining of the equipment that will provide broadband communications. The National Broadband Plan assembled by the FCC estimates that cost to be between $12 billion and $16 billion over a 10-year period. The discussion draft directs that the D block be auctioned and that the proceeds from that auction and the auction of several other spectrum blocks be applied to the build-out and the upkeep costs of the first responder network. The draft authorizes general fund appropriations to cover any shortfall between the costs of the network and the auction proceeds for the D block and those other areas of spectrum that would be auctioned. A strong federal government role in funding the network build-out, as detailed in the discussion draft, will be essential if a true nationwide network is to be realized. In rural areas, in particular, the localities will have great difficulty affording the build-out costs in the absence of federal government financial participation in funding those costs. The bipartisan legislative draft acknowledges and accommodates that reality. The discussion draft also recognizes the 24 megahertz of 700 band spectrum that is already held by the public safety community. This current spectrum holding was deemed adequate by the FCC's analysis for the nationwide broadband first responder network that we now need to realize. Some, however, have proposed a different path forward than the bipartisan staff discussion draft. They would give the D block to public safety to be combined with public safety's existing spectrum holdings. The most significant shortcoming from that option is that it would not provide the funding that is necessary for building out public safety's network. While some contend that public safety could lease parts of the D block to commercial entities and apply the revenue from the leases to the build-out, maintenance, and operational costs, I question whether sufficient revenue from leasing could be realized, particularly in rural areas, to assure the funding of the network costs. And it is the rural build-out costs that may prove most challenging for local governments to fund on their own. The option of giving the D block to public safety would also require that Congress find offsets for the D block's value. While we don't know with certainty what value the Congressional Budget Office would assign to the D block, current estimates place it between $2 billion and $3 billion. That is money Congress would have to identify and acquire before a single penny could be spent on constructing the network. We have an historic opportunity to make our nation more secure and give first responders a crucial tool they urgently need. And I urge all members to keep this goal in mind as we consider and determine how best to proceed. I expect that we'll receive thoughtful analysis on those questions from today's witnesses. We will also at today's hearing consider H.R. 4829, the Next Generation 9/11 Preservation Act of 2010, which was introduced by our committee colleagues, Ms. Eshoo of California and Mr. Shimkus of Illinois. This measure would reauthorize the Enhanced 911 Act of 2004 and facilitate the migration of today's Enhanced 911 emergency communication systems to IP-based systems known as Next Generation 911 that could support multimedia communications, including text, email, and video. I want to thank our committee colleagues for bringing this thoughtful measure before us. It will be considered as a part of today's hearing. Thanks to our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to your thoughtful analysis. And I also want to say thank you to the members of this subcommittee on both sides of the aisle who have participated in a bipartisan fashion in putting forward the discussion draft of the Public Safety Broadband Act of 2010. That concludes my opening statement, and I'm pleased now to recognize the ranking Republican member of our subcommittee, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and also to welcome all of our witnesses this morning. We appreciate your time. Mr. Chairman, before I give all my comments on this hearing, I'd like to note that this morning the FCC is considering a notice of inquiry to reclassify broadband as a Title II service. Broadband deployment and adoption are top priorities, and Chairman Janikowski's plan to treat broadband similar to a public utility, I think, will hurt investment and possibly hurt innovation. Our current free market pro-investment policies have served us well. Approximately 95% of Americans have access to broadband, and approximately 200 million subscribe at home today, and this is up from 8 million just 10 years ago. By comparison, it took 75 years to go from 8 million voice subscribers to 200 million under the old Title II common carrier regulations. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope that we can soon have a hearing on the FCC's notice of inquiry. I think it's only appropriate, considering what Chairman Janikowski is doing, so that we have an opportunity, both sides of the aisle can look at this issue and assess what he's doing. As you mentioned, this hearing we're examining two very important pieces of legislation. The first is draft legislation to fund a nationwide interoperable public safety broadband network. I agree with the overall approach of the draft legislation, but perhaps the language could go further. I support the draft bill to the extent it uses revenue from a straight commercial auction of the D block to fund a network on the 24 megahertz public safety already available. The FCC has concluded that the spectrum that has already been cleared for public safety is sufficient to simply build a network. But we need to be sure, however, that the legislation prohibits the FCC from imposing network neutrality or other such conditions and does not allow the FCC to rig the auction in favor of specific business models. The 2005 DTV legislation, which made this spectrum available, left the FCC too much discretion in how to structure this auction. As we saw with the 700 megahertz auction in 2008, network neutrality and public safety conditions reduced the revenues by $5 billion, sidelined both the 24 megahertz of public safety spectrum and the commercial D block, and crowded out smaller carriers. Absent explicit prohibitions in the legislation, we can have no assurances that the FCC won't impose conditions on the D block auction that will hurt it again, harming spectrum policy and reducing proceeds we need to fund the public safety network. Instead of a commercial auction, some argue that Congress should pass a law to give the D block directly to the public safety community for free. This would do little good, however, absent funding to construct the network. In this time of huge deficits and mounting public debt, it makes the most sense to raise the money through an auction to fund the network. We are now close to the 9-year anniversary of September 11th, terrorist attacks, and yet we still do not have a nationwide interoperable broadband public safety network. This is too important, and we have already wasted too much time. The other bill under discussion this morning is H.R. 4829, the Next Generation 9/11 Preservation Act of 2010. This bill could also improve our nation's public safety. Mr. Shimkus and Ms. Eshoo introduced this bill to expedite the ongoing migration of 9/11 service to enhanced 9/11 service that can automatically identify the location of the caller, to upgrade our entire 9/11 system for next-generation Internet-enabled networks and capabilities that incorporate advanced texting and video applications, and to reduce misuse of 9/11 fees, which some state and local governments divert to fill holes in their budget. With a few changes, the bill might help to not only modernize our 9/11 system, but also to make it more economically and administratively efficient. Obviously, as a concern, the bill costs and authorizes about $250 million a year for the next 5 years. Frankly, we're having a little trouble finding money for the broadband public safety network, so this is a very notable goal, a thoughtful bill. I support it. I just want to make sure that we can also find the money to do this. So, Mr. Chairman, I think it's a very good hearing. I welcome this opportunity. Again, I would reiterate, I think it would be appropriate that this committee, subcommittee, have a hearing on the FCC's notice of inquiry as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stearns. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Gordon, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a long panel here to this morning. I will pass so we can get on to the hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. We will add your opening statement time to your time for questioning our panel of witnesses. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling the hearing and the discussion of both bills. The D block has been a problem for us. We tried to auction it off to get it in the hands, and that was a failure. So now we're revisiting it. I think we had good hearings. I don't know how long ago, 6-10 months ago, on this issue, and I think we're moving in the right direction. So we look forward to continue to work with you on that issue. I also want to commend my colleague Anna Eshoo on her work and us moving forward on the E911 bill and the funds issues, not only getting technology in the hands of first-line responders, but also helping them afford some of this. And this is something that I think we can move forward. I want to highlight Jill Pender, who's leaving. I know Anna will probably mention her. She's leaving the stress and strain of the Hill to go to the peace and quiet of the FCC. So, I wish her well in that. It might be more peaceful here than returning there right now. The last thing is there's a budgetary crisis across this country, and all we want is kind of truth in advertising. If states are taking money to help deploy 911 funds, that's where the money goes to. And our bill says you don't get federal additional help if you don't do that. When we first started this process, Illinois was a good actor, and our money was going in the right direction. Since then, we've turned to be a bad actor. We're $12.5 billion in debt, and we've raided the funds. Shame on us, and that's why we've done great work. And thank you for sharing Jill with us, too. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Shimkus. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to commend you on this hearing. It is a privilege for me to participate in today's legislative hearing, for it raises a number of the most critical national security and public safety needs and demands that this subcommittee could possibly address. And that is to promote the nation's public safety by ensuring multiple public safety agencies in multiple jurisdictions, including our heroic first responders, that they have reliable access to adequate wireless spectrum and interoperable equipment during times of disaster, crises, and emergencies. These matters are very important to me, and I emphasize with the frustration of the public safety community, being proud to have co-sponsors legislation such as Congresswoman Harmon's Emergency Communications Bill, H.R. 3633, which helps states to supply public safety personnel with interoperable communications equipment and training. But what we have now, Mr. Chairman, is a Tower of Babel situation of sorts, where public safety agencies operate on different and non-adjacent channels as spectrum allocations. Even though these public safety agencies, officials, and workers must communicate using a common language with no, and I emphasize no, margin for delay, these problems of interoperability have slowed response efforts considerably, costing people their lives, their homes, and their loved ones. Despite the legitimate issues of how we will pay for these interoperable networks and what are the best approaches to promoting spectral efficiency and maximizing the utility of these frequencies for our society, we are taking a vitally important step today by bringing this discussion up for a hearing and refusing to ignore these problems or to delay action any longer. Let me also commend Ms. Eshu and Mr. Shimkus, for introducing H.R. 4829. Based on my reading of the bill, it will accelerate the migration of voice-centric 911 services and systems to IP-enabled next-generation 911 and emergency communications services and systems. The bill will make these services universally available and accessible to all Americans, including the disabled and those with hearing, vision, and speech impairments. Additionally, it will provide matching grant funding assistance to eligible entities so that we can migrate more quickly to these next-generation services, the supporting the IP-enabled backbones and emergency network for those services, and the necessary software to coordinate and interconnect our numerous emergency response organizations. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to ensuring testimony and discussion during today's hearing. And I want to thank you, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rush. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, the ranking member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I commend you on holding a hearing with what's going on downstairs. It is good that we have a subcommittee that is focusing on things that don't make the media attention but are very important. And I'm not saying what's happening downstairs is not important, but we do commend you for holding this hearing. We want to focus on our public safety technology goals today. Specifically, we're going to discuss the FCC's plans, the current discussion draft to begin the build-out of a truly nationwide, truly interoperable broadband network for the public safety community. The good news is that everyone in the room agrees on the goal, which is to build a robust network that will allow all of our first responders to communicate with each other, both in the everyday business of responding to fires, highway accidents, but also during a large-scale tragedy like the 911 attack. This goal should be the singular focus. I want to commend Chairman Janikowski of the FCC and their staff, and the staff of the National Broadband Team, based on their work and their conclusions about the state of broadband in the country, that 95% of the country has access to broadband and that 200 million people have actually adopted it. Our deregulatory posture that we've used so far in this country has been successful. I'm deeply disturbed by today's action of the FCC and the Commission potentially to move towards reclassifying broadband as a Title II service. In my mind, this is a misguided decision. It contradicts and ignores explicit congressional intent, not to mention the Obama administration's promise to start creating jobs. I hope that we can have a hearing, Mr. Chairman, on that issue in the very near future. That disagreement aside, there is no disagreement about public safety. The Commission got some of the things right in the plan. I want to congratulate Admiral Barnett on his work and also the issues surrounding the 700 megahertz D block. Back in 2007, I laid out a framework for a D block auction that is both the basis of the FCC's plan and for today's discussion draft. Auction the D block for commercial purposes, use the proceeds to build and operate the public safety network. The public safety community argues that they don't have enough spectrum and should be given the broadband. They argue that their current 10 megahertz won't be enough. I understand their concerns, but I disagree with that. If we do it right, we can have private industry pay us to build a network and then give the public safety community the ability to use the right amount of spectrum when the inevitable emergencies occur. We need to focus on how to maximize the revenue from the auction of the D block for commercial purposes. Maximizing those proceeds will do the most for getting this moving the right way. Imposing onerous conditions on the spectrum, barring particular market players from participating, only devalues the value of that spectrum. In my mind, there's no doubt about that. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I'm anxious to hear from the witnesses today about their opinion of H.R. 4829. We obviously need to upgrade our 911 service for a new technological world. When the current White House spends billions of dollars the way the previous administration spent millions, $250 million a year could be considered pocket change. I believe, though, that the system should be modernized, made as efficient as possible. We need to be sure that the taxpayers' money we make available for that work is well spent, and ideally is offset by spending cuts in services that are less vital. With that, Mr. Chairman, I welcome our witnesses, especially Admiral Barnett, to the committee, and look forward to their testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barton. The gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, chairman of the full committee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for scheduling this critically important hearing, and I want to thank you and Ranking Members Barton and Stearns for their constructive contribution to the bipartisan staff discussion draft, and I look forward to continued bipartisan collaboration. Last September, this subcommittee held a hearing to explore recent developments regarding the creation of a nationwide interoperable broadband network for public safety. There was a consensus that constructing a nationwide public safety broadband network remains a critical unfinished business from 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina. In my statement, I identified 3 goals. First, the network or networks must be built quickly. Secondly, there must be a clear plan to ensure that deployment reaches all areas of the country. And third, the plan should avoid distorting or disrupting the commercial wireless marketplace by giving an unfair advantage to certain carriers over others. I think the bipartisan discussion draft more than meets these essential goals. First, it allows for the immediate start of network construction, gives the NTIA the authority to start funding projects as soon as the rules are in place, even prior to any auctions. As the FCC notes in its broadband plan, we need to act quickly to gain substantial cost savings regarding network construction. If we're unable to take advantage of commercial construction schedules, the cost of building this network increases dramatically, possibly 3 times as high. Secondly, by providing the requisite funding for a network across the nation, all communities, not just major cities with large budgets, will be able to construct their portion of the network. Specifically, the discussion draft contemplates federal government covering 80% of construction costs and 50% of the ongoing costs associated with this network. The stark budget realities that the state and local governments face today would make it difficult for them to construct this network without such assistance. And finally, the draft legislation does not distort competition in the wireless market. In fact, by setting deadlines for specific spectrum auctions to occur, the discussion draft should help promote competition by ensuring the availability of additional spectrum. I know this discussion draft doesn't satisfy all the public safety community, and several associations and their corporate partners have launched a campaign to convince Congress to give public safety 10 megahertz of spectrum, the so-called D block. It's my firm view, however, that this singular focus on the D block undercuts what we all want to achieve, a sustainable nationwide broadband network for public safety. Indeed, some have suggested to us that they would prefer to have the D block of spectrum rather than the substantial federal support contemplated by the discussion draft. I don't think that's a tenable position.
Spectrum without a viable plan to utilize it efficiently will create a network of haves and have-nots, and I urge advocates of this position to reconsider this all-or-nothing approach. Indeed, the FCC's National Broadband Plan has amplified my concern about this spectrum-first approach. In a detailed technical paper released earlier this week, the FCC concluded that 10 megahertz of dedicated spectrum allocated to public safety in the 700 megahertz band for broadband communications provides more capacity than it needs on a day-to-day and emergency basis. But the FCC also concluded that giving public safety an additional megahertz of spectrum would not guarantee public safety sufficient capacity in a worst-case emergency like 9/11. And that's why the FCC has instead proposed that public safety be guaranteed priority access to hardened commercial networks. This would give public safety much greater capacity than it needs when it needs it the most. All 5 FCC commissioners agreed that the FCC's plan is the best approach for public safety. The FCC plan and the staff discussion draft would allow us to make a multi-billion-dollar down payment on a nationwide network with the proceeds of the D-Block auction. Although the funding contemplated in the discussion draft is a good start, I'm committed to working with our colleagues and the administration to find additional funding sources, including future spectrum auction proceeds. Moreover, I hope that public safety is able to take advantage of the flexibility in the draft legislation to generate additional revenues through leasing fees and partnerships with critical infrastructure providers and other entities. I'd like to thank our witnesses for their participation today. I look forward to your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman Waxman. The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, is recognized for 2 minutes.
I will waive my opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Terry. We will add your time to your questioning period. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshu, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and how the importance of it is more than obvious. We need to explore public safety interoperability issues, especially with regard to E911. And I'd like to thank both the chairman and Mr. Shimkus for the kind remarks that they made about the legislation and the effort that we launched as co-chairs of the E911 caucus. The NG 911 bill provides essential funding for 911 grants to bring us past enhanced 911 and into the next generation, where call centers and first responders have interoperable communications and the ability to use new technology to improve their response capabilities. We've done a lot of work on this legislation. We've met with industry and agency representatives to discuss their perspectives, and we've determined that the E911 Coordination Office really should remain at NHTSA to ensure the ongoing success of its work. So I look forward to this discussion. I think that we need to explore amending the draft public safety bill to provide directed funding for these call centers. This is an integral part of our public safety system in the country. And to leave that out, I think really will leave our citizens in a lurch. These call centers deal with life and death issues every day. So we're going to have to work hard on that and identify financial resources to achieve the goal. But to leave it out, I think we will pay a huge price for that. I also want to draw attention to the funding section of the draft Public Safety Bill, Title III, where there seems to be language that would once again delay the use of the AWS-3 spectrum in the 2155, 2180 megahertz band. I've spoken numerous times about this issue on the need to roll out the fallow spectrum now instead of delaying its use with pie-in-the-sky pairing plans. I don't think we can allow valuable spectrum to lie dormant for years. So I will support language that sets a date certain for the auction, but since the FCC already has an established record to schedule the auction, I think we should have a much earlier deadline than the one specified in the draft bill. And I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a statement by M2Z, who plans to bid on this spectrum and use it for a nationwide wireless broadband lifeline. So we have a lot to discuss. I thank you for your leadership, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back any time that I might have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Eshoo. And without objection, that statement will be received in the record. Actually, you owe us about a minute, but we'll be generous in the repayment terms. The gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, I want to join Mr. Stearns in expressing my disappointment in what is transpiring at the FCC as we speak, with their short-sighted efforts, in my opinion, to stifle innovation, destroy jobs, and to take over the Internet. It is an unnecessary step. Moving on, I am pleased that our committee is convening today to discuss public safety needs and spectrum on the D block. I feel confident that we can find bipartisan support for this measure. I am certain that all of you are glad to see that there is bipartisan support. And I'm encouraged that so many on this committee are advocating for an auction of spectrum, and I hope that my colleagues outside this committee will learn from what we are attempting to do, which is to reject an idea that we cannot pay for, no matter how much merit there seems to be for that idea on the surface. While I strongly support public safety, having the spectrum and equipment it needs to effectively and efficiently do its job, giving away valuable spectrum, quite frankly, is not affordable and not feasible at this time. In closing, I just want to make a couple of quick points. First, I would implore our friends in the industry to stand with us on this and not change their collective minds 3/4 of the way through the process. And second, I would ask my colleagues to make the auction of spectrum available without any conditions attached, especially open access or limitations on who can bid on the spectrum. This would be bad policy and only reduce revenue to pay for the public safety network. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back so that there is a little bit of time to apply toward Ms. Eshoo's time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Blackburn. The gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you for holding this hearing today, Mr. Chairman. As a representative of earthquake territory, I'm keenly aware of the urgent need for first responders to be effectively communicating with one another and with the public in the event of a national disaster or other emergency. And I want to thank today's witnesses for sharing their expertise on this subject. H.R. 4829, the Next Generation 911 Preservation Act, is intended to help modernize and improve emergency services by providing support for the new technologies, and I commend my colleague, Ms. Eshoo, for her efforts. This morning I'll be listening for solutions that provide the greatest public benefit in safety. I've heard from many of my constituents, including law enforcement professionals, with strong views on the proposed legislation. It's vitally important that this network is built quickly, cost-effectively, and meets all of our nation's police, firefighter, EMTs, and other first responder needs. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. McNerney. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Weiner, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank all the members of the panel. I'd name them individually, but then I'd have no more of my 2 minutes left. There are a lot of you here, and I'm glad that you are. I do want to particularly single out perhaps the most, one of the most important members of the panel, Deputy Chief Charles Dowd of the New York City Police Department, who every day has to deal in a real-life way with the challenge of having a communication infrastructure that supports 35,000 some odd police officers in a city of 8 million people that swells to about 12 million during every day, and doesn't have to think about the challenges of terrorism and communications in a crisis as an abstract, because frankly we encounter it every day. Chief Dowd is someone who has dedicated his entire life to the safety and security of the people of New York City and those that visit it, and I want to thank him for being here. I am a sponsor of the King bill, but I have great empathy for the position that Mr. Waxman takes, that we do have to figure out a way to have a sustainable structure, and I think that that somewhere between the King language and Mr. Waxman's proposal to have some of it subject to auction, I think we can find common ground. The one thing we can't allow, though, is any more years of inertia here, and I think that's a common thread of statement by my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, and I think all 16 members of the panel here will probably agree with that. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Wiener. The gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses who are here today. I'm looking forward to hearing from you and learning more about what we can finally do to get a public safety network up and running. It's almost inconceivable that 9 years after the terrorist attacks of September 11th and after Hurricane Katrina, the United States still doesn't have a national public safety network. With the help of the 9/11 Commission, we've learned many lessons. We need a public safety network for our first responders, whether there are fearless police officers, firefighters out there protecting our homes and businesses. I know there might be some disagreement about the best way to set up the network, but I think we all agree that it's a national security priority and it will be an invaluable asset to our community. So I'd like to hear from you on what you believe is best. That's why we're here today. So I'd like to raise a few questions for you all to consider as we move forward. First, I understand that the primary benefit of auctioning off the D block and sharing spectrum with commercial providers is affordability. Without a spectrum auction, it could be very difficult to raise the money needed to build out a public safety network. So the question is, will it be possible to raise funds for the network if there is no auction? What is the public safety community's proposed alternative for raising these funds in lieu of an auction? Second, operability is key to the success of the public safety network. What are the projected spectrum needs of the approximately 2 million first responders who will be using it? Will they need more than they have now? How will operability be impacted by a sharing arrangement? Will logistical challenges necessarily be greater on a shared network? Third, time is of the essence. Every day that we do not have a fully operational public safety network is a day that our communities are less safe than they should be. What is the timeline for getting the network up and running under the current proposals laid out in the National Broadband Plan, and what are the alternatives to that? So I want to thank you for considering these questions. I look forward to your testimony, and we're all grateful for your service day in and day out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Castor. The gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. I just think one task before us is to find the confidence of law enforcement if we're going to move forward. I've met with my local law enforcement community out in Washington, and there are real concerns about assuring that, in fact, in any system like this, that we, in fact, give priority to law enforcement and emergency responders on networks, number one. Number two, that there is total confidence that spectrum will be available as additional needs grow. And third, there's some increasing interest in regional networks instead of maybe perhaps a national one in this regard. So I'll be looking for ideas on how to win that confidence in any process in this regard. And I think we have a lot of work to do to try to reach that. And look forward to working with all the witnesses in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Inslee. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Harmon, while not a member of our subcommittee, is certainly welcome in our proceedings this morning, and I'm pleased to recognize her for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I miss my service on this subcommittee because I think it deals with absolutely critical issues like this one. Like other senior members of this committee, I was here on 9/11. No one will forget that many, especially firefighters, died in New York City because the NYPD circling overhead could not communicate with them to tell them that the World Trade Center towers were glowing red and immediate evacuation was required. 9 years later, as some have pointed out, we have still not fixed this problem. We have operability in some geographic areas like New York City and among D.C. area fire and police, but we do not have a national interoperable emergency communications capability. As many know, my focus in Congress is security, and I know how possible and devastating a series of near simultaneous terror attacks in the cities around the U.S. could be. We do not have the communications infrastructure we will need in that event. Unfortunately, as some have said, the legislative and administrative efforts so far have lagged. I co-authored with our former colleague Kurt Weldon the HERO Act to set a date certain for a transition to a national interoperability network space. We never got there. The DTV transition, which this committee was involved in, cleared the analog spectrum, but it doesn't have this capability up and running. The D-block auction failed, as some have pointed out. The PSIC bill, which I co-authored earlier this year and Mr. Rush mentioned, is a success, but it funds local projects. It doesn't fund a national interoperable network. And the bright spot is the E911 effort that Ms. Eshoo has championed for years. But I just want to say that this new discussion draft is the best opportunity we have had to resolve the problem. It would generate funds to build out spectrum. It would give public safety priority access and roaming. It insists on a network of networks. That's the key to making this interoperable. And as I understand it, there's agreement on most issues, but not all. I just want to say, as a volunteer to this subcommittee for the morning, we must resolve the outstanding issues. We must enact the legislation. We must build out this network yesterday. And in conclusion, everyone loses if we fail to do it. We all have family and friends in communities across the country, any of which could be a target. Their lives will depend on our prompt action, and so do the lives of firefighters and police. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting me participate.
Thank you very much, Ms. Harmon. We're happy to have you here this morning. I'm pleased now to recognize our panel of witnesses, and I'll say a brief word of introduction about each of them. Rear Admiral James Barnett is the Chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau at the FCC. Mr. Charles Dowd is the Deputy Chief of the New York City Police Department's Communications Division. Mr. Jonathan Moore is the Director of Fire and EMS Operations and GIS Services for the International Association of Firefighters. Mr. Dale Hatfield is an adjunct professor in the Interdisciplinary Telecommunications Program at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Mr. Steve Zipperstein is the Vice President for Legal and External Affairs and General Counsel for Verizon Wireless. Mr. Joseph Handley is the Vice President of Technology Planning and Services for Telephone and Data Systems Incorporated. Mr. Coleman Bazelon is the Principal for the Bertel Group. And Mr. Brian Fonts is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Emergency Number Association. We welcome each of you this morning and thank you for taking time to share your views on this urgent subject with us. Without objection, your full written statements will be made a part of our record of proceedings, and we would welcome your oral statement and ask that each of you keep that oral statement to approximately 5 minutes. Admiral Barnett, we welcome you this morning and will be pleased to begin at your end of the table.
Thanks, sir. Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Stearns, and members of the subcommittee, including volunteers, thank you for attaching my full testimony. We'd also ask that the FCC's white paper on capacity and on the cost model also be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Here's a summation of my testimony. We as a nation must seize this brief technological opportunity to create a truly nationwide, truly interoperable broadband public safety network. And there's nothing that's inevitable about such a network. And if we're going to ensure and afford interoperability, then we need to have a really well-researched and comprehensive plan. The Navy transferred me to Washington, D.C. in October 2001 when there was still a gaping hole in the side of the Pentagon. And since, as we now look at the 9th anniversary of 9/11 coming up, and with all the other disasters the nation has faced in the meantime, we still do not have the level of interoperability for public safety that they desperately need. So as we move forward, we have to recognize that already billions of dollars have been spent in really energetic efforts, and yet we're no closer. But now, after considerable research and numerous communications and meetings with public safety leaders, the National Broadband Plan recommends an innovative approach to solve the 9/11 interoperability problem once and for all. And I would ask that Sarah bring up the slide Appendix B. This shows some of the components of our plan. The core of the network is the 10 megahertz dedicated to public safety. And we cannot think of this spectrum in terms of the old technologies. With modern cell architecture, with the latest technologies, and with good spectrum management, 10 megahertz can actually perform like 160 megahertz would on the current public safety voice networks. This will provide more than enough capacity for day-to-day operations and for most emergencies. But we also must plan for the worst emergencies, the next 9/11. And in thinking through that, an additional 10 megahertz, merely adding 10 megahertz such as the D block, might not be enough to really handle the load. And that's why the FCC has proposed that public safety have the ability to have priority access and roaming over onto commercial networks. Now, that means first-in-line privileges for up to 40, 50, maybe 60 additional megahertz. Another feature of this is that it provides an additional advantage in that it provides resiliency and redundancy for public safety networks in case they go down, as happened in D.C. Back in March. So we have created an in-depth cost model which shows the way to afford 99% population coverage for the network. And to ensure an iron rule of interoperability, we've already stood up and established the Emergency Response Interoperability Center, or ERIC, and we will work with public safety and with our federal partners to make sure that it's effective. Now, it might surprise some to know how much agreement there is with public safety, between public safety and the FCC's proposal. We agree on the LT technology. We agree on the roaming and priority access. We agree on the Interoperability Center. We agree on the need for public funding. We need to make sure that there is in-building coverage, that it extends to inside buildings and the network is hardened. And we agree that there should be early deployment. So the only major disagreement is on the D block itself, and not all public safety even disagrees on that. Now, Congress has indicated that we are to, by legislation currently, that we are to auction the D block. And here's why the FCC does not recommend reallocating the D block. It will nearly destroy the commercial market for equipment and devices for public safety, isolating public safety on a technological island the way they are today. It will vastly increase the cost of building the network for public safety by billions of dollars, and it will increase the cost to public safety of operating the network by billions of dollars. And if the network is that much more expensive, as Chairman Waxman mentioned a minute ago, it will create a patchwork system across the country of haves and have-nots. Perhaps some big cities may be able to afford it. Most rural areas will not. And if Sarah could bring up Appendix F, it also may mean that we would have more than 20, 25 years in order to spread the network across the network. And if it's not nationwide, then it's truly not interoperable. I think that some in public safety have this idea that they'll be able to take the D block and sublease it to carriers for some type of revenue, and that would pay for the network. But unlike the FCC, no one has come forward with any type of cost model or business plan or financial analysis that shows this will work. And in our view, the amount of revenue that would come in for some of the big cities would not be able to fund the entire network. Let me shift for a moment to Next Generation 911. H.R. 4829 and its companion bill in the Senate 3111 advance the vision for the rapid deployment of Next Generation 911 as we move into the IP-based broadband world. We see it as entirely consistent with the National Broadband Plan and a necessary step forward, not only for public safety, but for the safety of the public. Let me stop here. I'll look forward to your questions, and thank you again for the opportunity to address you today.
Thank you very much, Admiral Barnett. Mr. Dowd. And Mr. Dowd, if you would pull that microphone as close as you can and make sure that it's turned on.
I want to make sure you can hear.
That's good.
Good morning, Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Stearns, members of the subcommittee. I'm Deputy Chief Charles Dowd, Commanding Officer of the New York City Police Department's Communications Division. On behalf of Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to discuss with you today the critical need for Congress to act to ensure that public safety agencies will be able to communicate effectively now and in the future. I speak today not only for the NYPD and the City of New York, but also on behalf of virtually all of my colleagues in public safety, represented by the 21,000 members of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the 13,000 members, chiefs of the International Association of Fire Chiefs, the National Sheriff's Association, the Metropolitan Fire Chiefs, the Major Cities Police Chiefs, the Major Counties Sheriff's Association, the Association of Public Safety Communications Officials, and the National Emergency Management Association. We are joined in this effort by the National Governors Association, the National Conference of State Legislatures, the Council of State Governments, the National Association of Counties, the National Leagues of Cities, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and the International City County Management Association, and many others that I couldn't list here today. We jointly and urgently request that Congress take immediate action to reallocate and assign the 700 megahertz D block of broadband spectrum directly to public safety. Rather than conducting a public auction of this vital resource, we strongly support a bipartisan bill introduced by Representative Peter King. This legislation, H.R. 5081, currently co-sponsored by 24 members of the House, including Representative Anthony Weiner, Vice Chairman of this subcommittee, would accomplish this purpose, and we ask that Congress swiftly approve the bill and send it to the President for his signature. In previous testimony before this committee, we have said that broadband technology will create a paradigm shift in public safety communications. The events in Mumbai, India, and more recently in Times Square confirm the need for information sharing capabilities that will allow first responders to be effective in preventing such attacks. The ability to share information in real time on a local, state, and federal level is critical to that goal. The staff discussion draft, referred to by this committee as the Public Safety Act of 2010, is fatally flawed legislation in that it calls for the auction of the D block. It does address some of the public safety's needs, as Admiral Bonnet already mentioned. It does address some of public safety's needs, designating other spectrum for auction, with the proceeds being dedicated to public safety broadband. It also talks about the establishment of an advisory board under the FCC, which most of us in public safety agree is a good idea. Such an entity could be successful if comprised of public safety practitioners as decision makers. The section on flexibility and sharing of broadband spectrum is an idea also generally supported by public safety as a way to fund and maintain the network. However, we cannot agree with the bill's intent to auction a resource as critical to public safety as the D block. Since the D block spectrum is adjacent to public safety broadband allocation, it is uniquely desirable, as it can provide needed additional capacity simply and elegantly, and simply is important, without complicating network or handset design. Any alternative spectrum offered would be less desirable, since additional components would be required, which would dramatically increase the cost while reducing performance. Non-adjacent spectrum blocks will not provide as much throughput capacity as the D block, since greater efficiency is achieved through spectrum aggregation. This is the essence of broadband. If adding sites were the solution to network capacity shortage, there'd be no contention for or market for the D block. Rather than seeking additional spectrum, network operators would simply add more sites. This is clearly not the case. Allocating the D block to public safety will also provide first responders with the bandwidth required for the eventual migration of mission-critical voice to 700 LTE as envisioned in the National Broadband Plan. The NYPD shares this vision and looks forward to the day when public safety users can share a nationwide network that supports mission-critical voice, video, and data on an integrated wireless network and abandon the web of disparate legacy networks that impede interoperability today. The D block is the cornerstone of the Mission Critical Voice Foundation. Without it, a mission critical voice and data network would not be possible. The City of New York filed a white paper with the FCC describing the spectrum needs for an integrated voice and data network several months ago. As public safety experts, we contend that that filing provided proof that the 10 megahertz of dedicated spectrum is insufficient for public safety's needs during emergencies. We have submitted a copy for the record of this hearing. Our experience with commercial network failures tells us we need network control to ensure guaranteed access and security. Commercial networks are simply not built to the same standards of reliability and survivability as our public safety networks. In a timely 60 Minutes broadcast last Sunday, federal officials criticized the utility industry for failing to safeguard their networks and systems from intrusion and malicious software. It was clear that the biggest impediment to protecting the power grid was the utility's unwillingness to spend profits to secure their systems? What assurance do we have that commercial carriers will provide the adequate network security and robust build-out that public safety requires and demands? And by the way, again, our experience over the years tells us that they will not. The nationwide network will be interconnected to confidential databases and secure servers that need to be protected. We need to have the option to build our own secure networks and manage the security of these networks ourselves. Public safety organizations mentioned at the beginning of my testimony are unified in the goal of establishing for the first time a nationwide interoperable mission-critical voice and data public safety broadband network. They are not motivated by profit or politics. Their only motivation is the ability to serve the public they're sworn to protect. On behalf of those organizations, I thank you for your attention to this important issue, and we're happy to answer any questions from the members of the subcommittee.
Thank you very much, Chief Dowd. Mr. Moore.
Excuse me. Thank you, Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Stearns, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Jonathan Moore, and I'm the Director of Fire and EMS Operations and GIS Services for the International Association of Firefighters. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today on behalf of General President Schaeferger and the nearly 300,000 firefighters and emergency medical personnel who comprise our organization. Mr. Chairman, I testify today not only as a representative of the IFF, but as a former firefighter who understands the critical importance of effective and reliable public safety communications. While Congress and the FCC have taken important steps forward to establish a public safety broadband network, establishing such a network is only the tip of the iceberg. Much work remains to be done to improve not only interoperable communications, but basic operable radio communications within individual police and fire departments. For years, the IFF has participated in the ongoing dialogue among members of the public safety community, telecommunications industry, and elected officials about how to best utilize evolving communications technology. We believe that the broadband technology can provide public safety with the ability to quickly communicate complicated information, and that the broadband plan proposed by the FCC will deliver a functional and affordable broadband network to public safety. We believe that the 10 megahertz currently allocated to public safety, combined with roaming and priority access on the D block and other networks as proposed by the FCC, will provide public safety with adequate capacity for everyday use as well as large-scale emergencies. Furthermore, because such partnerships will be required to meet the requirements established by the Emergency Response Interoperability Center, which itself will be advised by public safety, we have confidence that they will meet the public safety's mission-critical standards. The argument that public safety needs 20 megahertz depends on a number of assumptions which are unlikely to occur: that a majority of public safety agencies will participate in the network, and that a majority of agencies will utilize the myriad of applications envisioned for such a network. This sort of buy-in is unlikely to happen for several reasons, including use of alternate networks, personal preference, and perhaps most importantly, cost. Perhaps the most important aspect of the FCC plan is the fact that it proposes both short and long-term funding mechanisms to help build and maintain the public safety network. The plan also ensures that the network is affordable to its users by leveraging commercial technology and utilizing the GSA schedule to provide reasonable benchmark rates for public safety equipment and network access. As public safety budgets nationwide face significant cuts in the current economy, affordability is key to making any network interoperable on a nationwide level. Some in industry and the public safety community have suggested that the FCC plan is insufficient to meet public safety needs and instead recommend reallocating the D block to public safety. While well-intentioned, we believe that this proposal is not only unnecessary, but unrealistic. As a case in point, the legislation reallocating the D block to public safety has been introduced in the House by Representative Peter King. However, the bill proposes no funding mechanism to build or maintain the network. While we support the FCC plan and the establishment of a nationwide public safety broadband network, building such a network will in no way address the real communications dilemma facing the majority of America's first responders, achieving basic communications operability. The communications failures of 9/11, Oklahoma City, and Katrina are often cited as proof of why a nationwide interoperable communications network is needed. Yet these were not failures of interoperability, but rather failures of basic operability. Despite the promise of broadband for the foreseeable future, communications in the fire service will continue to be dependent on radio, and ensuring firefighters have basic radio communications capabilities must continue to be our top priority. The safety of both firefighters and the public depends on reliable, functional communication tools that work in the extreme environments in which firefighters operate. With zero visibility, in high heat, wearing self-contained breathing apparatuses that distort the voice, and gloves that make operation of a complicated handset difficult. Firefighters operate inside structures of varying sizes and construction types, which have a direct impact on the ability of a radio wave to penetrate the structure and be interpreted by the receiver. It is precisely this environment that makes the application of new technology so challenging. Current digital radio technology, for example, is largely unintelligible on the fireground. Any communications technology must take all of these factors into consideration. Communications technology must not only be reliable and functional, it must also be affordable. Fire departments will simply be unable to utilize new technology if it's too expensive. Focusing time and resources on fixing these and other basic communications issues will have a larger impact on public safety than will the establishment of any broadband network. Moreover, failure to address the challenges of communications on the fireground will undermine the entire purpose of creating a broadband network. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moore. Mr. Hatfield.
Chairman Boucher, ranking members of the Member Stearns and members of the subcommittee, I'm very pleased and honored to appear before you today to testify on the draft legislation that would provide funding for constructing and maintaining an interoperable public safety broadband network. My name is Dale Hatfield, and I'm the executive director of the Silicon Flatiron Center for Law, Technology, and Entrepreneurship at the University of Colorado at Boulder. While I have some other affiliations that are disclosed in my prepared remarks, my testimony here today reflects solely my own views, and any recommendations that I offer should not be ascribed to any of the other institutions with which I'm associated. I would be remiss if I did not begin my testimony by commending you for taking up an issue, the funding of a nationwide interoperable public safety broadband network that is so vital to the safety of life and property and to our homeland security. Past experience with large-scale man-made and natural disasters have clearly demonstrated the price we may pay in the future without such an interoperable network. Moreover, the challenges we have had in the past in developing and deploying an interoperable narrowband voice network for public safety use provide a warning of the hard work that lies ahead if we are going to realize the full benefits envisioned by an interoperable public safety broadband network. Fortunately, in my opinion, legislation along the lines that has been set forth in the staff draft, coupled with the recommendations and analyses presented in the National Broadband Plan, provide the necessary policy direction, funding sources, and analytical framework to ensure the successful deployment of such a nationwide network. Turning to my written testimony, I focused there on 4 areas. First, I addressed the importance of taking into account commercial equipment and technologies and the evolution of commercial wireless networks in establishing rules to ensure the deployment of an interoperable network. More specifically, Section 101 of the discussion draft directs the Commission in adopting the rules necessary to achieve interoperability to consider 1, the extent to which particular technologies and user equipment are or are likely to be available in the commercial marketplace, 2, the availability of necessary technologies and equipment on reasonable and non-discriminatory licensing terms, 3, the ability to evolve with technological developments in the commercial marketplace, and 4, the ability to accommodate prioritization for public safety transmissions. As I explained more fully in my written testimony, I believe these provisions are essential to developing the interoperability public safety broadband network. So, for among other things, the network will benefit from the economies of scale, increased competition, and rapid technological advances associated with the commercial marketplace. And also, importantly, because it will facilitate the ability of public safety users to roam onto and gain priority access to commercial networks in times of stress. Second, building upon some earlier testimony that I delivered to the subcommittee in December of last year, I addressed the importance of spectrum flexibility and sharing as raised in Section 103 of the discussion draft. I strongly support those provisions of the draft because I am convinced that we can no longer afford to leave vast stretches of valuable spectrum lying idle most of the time when there are technologies available to allow more efficient dynamic sharing of the resource while giving public safety entities access to large amounts of additional spectrum in extreme emergency situations. Third, I addressed the issue of the adequacy of the 10 megahertz of spectrum in the 700 megahertz band that has already been allocated to public safety for broadband networks. And having reviewed the white paper on capacity requirements released by the Commission on Tuesday, as well as some other documents, I state that I am in general agreement with the analysis contained therein. More specifically, I support both the conclusion that the 10 megahertz of spectrum already allocated is sufficient to meet the day-to-day and serious emergency broadband band requirements for public safety, and the concept of allowing public safety entities to gain access to substantial amounts of additional spectrum through priority access to and roaming access across commercial broadband spectrum. Again, this is consistent with my strongly held belief that better spectrum management requires more efficient dynamic sharing of the increasingly scarce spectrum resource. Fourth and finally, I addressed several less overarching issues to which I wanted to call to your attention, but because they are not central to the main issues and in the interest of time, I will not address them in this oral statement. That concludes my oral statement, Mr. Chairman. I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hatfield. Mr. Zipperstein.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Stearns, and members of the subcommittee. It's a privilege to be here with you today. In the 9 years since the 9/11 attacks, public attention is focused on the need for effective, interoperable first responder communications. Congress actually began to address this important issue 13 years ago in 1997 when it enacted legislation to reallocate certain 700 megahertz spectrum for public safety's use. Today, we endorse the work being done to continue those efforts by implementing a nationwide interoperable public safety broadband network that is effective, efficient, and sustainable. The FCC's National Broadband Plan delivered in March is a watershed event for public safety because it promises to change forever the way public safety officials communicate. By constructing a nationwide public safety broadband network, it will ensure that all first responders in all parts of the country, including rural America, will benefit from the broadband revolution. The FCC's plan provides several important benefits. First, it establishes a national framework for a network of networks with common technology and operational standards to ensure interoperability across the United States. Second, it leverages the benefits of commercial technologies, which will mean lower costs and more rapidly available equipment. Third, it promotes public-private partnerships that will enable public safety to leverage the considerable investments of the private sector. Public safety will have the ability to choose from many prospective partners, whether or not they hold licenses in the 700 band. In addition to Verizon Wireless, many other players in the industry, a wide variety of industry associations, including rural associations, have all endorsed this leveraged network approach. Fourth, the FCC plan will advance broadband deployment in rural areas by providing funds for new facilities where they're needed and promoting flexible partnerships to maximize those investments. This is the same kind of approach that we announced recently with our program to advance LTE in rural America, under which Verizon Wireless will work collaboratively with rural companies to build and operate fourth-generation networks where they currently have or plan to build their own infrastructure. Given the merits of a nationwide interoperable public safety broadband network, we commend the subcommittee and the staff for promptly considering legislation to authorize federal funding to support the construction and operation of such a network. We agree that the best way to fund this network is through future spectrum auctions. Given the FCC's aggressive plan for making new commercial spectrum available over the next decade, we believe there will be more than ample revenue to support the National Public Safety Network and other important legislative initiatives. The last two auctions alone raised nearly $33 billion, and that was a lot less than 500 megahertz of spectrum. By ensuring an adequate supply of spectrum for the future and enabling companies to acquire and use the spectrum without restriction, Congress will maximize the future auction revenues. So while the FCC's plan indeed is visionary, we disagree with it in just one respect. We do not believe it provides the spectrum necessary to ensure its successful implementation. As Chief Dowd has testified this morning, a broad alliance of public safety and state and local government organizations and the Attorney General of the United States have all concluded that public safety will need more spectrum to support the wide array of broadband applications that first responders will use in the future to protect us. The FCC did release a white paper this week reaching the opposite conclusion, but even the FCC's own study concedes that public safety will need additional spectrum during times of emergency. Yet the FCC concludes that during those times when effective communication is most crucial, public safety should be reliant on commercial networks, a conclusion that most in the public safety community believe defeats the very purpose of building a nationwide public safety network. It should come as no surprise that public safety now needs more spectrum than Congress or anyone else envisioned when it designated the original allocation 13 years ago. Much has changed in the wireless world during that time. 13 years ago, few people had ever heard of text messaging, yet today billions and billions of text messages traverse our wireless networks daily. 13 years ago, we were all using first-generation narrowband voice technology. Today, we're embarking on the transition to 4G technology, broadband technology that will support a wide array of data, multimedia, and video applications that public safety needs to protect us. Public safety should not be limited from taking advantage of these technological advancements because it doesn't have enough spectrum. So members of the subcommittee, great progress has been made. We applaud the progress. We applaud the draft legislation because it does solve two of the three critical components needed to address this issue, funding and infrastructure. All that's needed is sufficient spectrum. The FCC's broadband plan calls for almost 500 megahertz of additional spectrum over the next 10 years. The D block is just 2%, only 2% of that 500 megahertz of spectrum. We should consider the D block an investment in public safety, an investment in our future. The taxpayers own it today. They'll continue owning it in the future. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to announce that Verizon Wireless wholeheartedly supports H.R. 4829, the Next Generation 911 bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zipperstein. Mr. Handley.
Good morning, Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Stearns, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Joe Hanley, and I am a Vice President at TDS, the parent company of U.S. Cellular. U.S. Cellular serves over 6 million customers and has received 9 consecutive J.D. Power Awards for highest call quality in the North Central region. We are members of the Rural Cellular Association as well as CTIA, the Wireless Association. In addition to commercial users, our networks serve hundreds of public safety agencies throughout the country. Like other wireless carriers, we need more spectrum for fourth-generation services. U.S. Cellular is prepared to bid in future auctions, especially the D block. We therefore applaud the committee for its leadership in identifying 2 bands for auction and look forward to working with the committee to enact the legislation. When I testified before this committee last fall, I laid out 2 fundamental goals: providing interoperable broadband for public safety and fostering a competitive market for commercial broadband services. Both goals remain essential to the public interest, and I am pleased to say that both are advanced by the proposals in the National Broadband Plan and by the committee's bipartisan legislation. U.S. Cellular strongly supports the proposal to dedicate auction proceeds to fund the public safety network. We have long advocated for a win-win solution, one that delivers on the promise of a public safety broadband network, but also one that fosters competitive mobile broadband for all American consumers, urban and rural. The question has always been funding. The legislation's innovative proposal to use proceeds from 2 auctions is an important step forward. Congress should pass this legislation, and the FCC should move quickly to implement it. Let me make 2 specific comments about how Congress should direct the FCC to structure these auctions. First, it's critical the license areas be reasonably sized. Smaller license areas will bring in more bidders and generate more revenue, which means more resources for the public safety network. Furthermore, small license areas will allow local public safety officials to pursue partnerships with locally strong carriers who, especially in rural areas, often have the best networks and the greatest commitment to the local community. The 700 megahertz auction offered the D block as a national license. It also made the C block less competitive and generated lower revenues by using mega-regional licenses subject to package bidding. By contrast, a D block auction with area licenses would attract many carriers, large and small, that could build on their existing assets in each area. With the resources of multiple operators, network deployment will be faster, more extensive, and more reliable, with no single point of failure. We support cellular market areas, or CMAs, or as a second choice, the slightly larger economic areas, or EAs. Second, the auction procedures must be straightforward and fair, not biased in favor of large bidders. The 700 megahertz auction used package bidding, a procedure that allows large bidders to trump small ones by bidding on all or nothing packages of licenses. As the experience of this auction demonstrates, package bidding only serves to create opportunities for the largest bidders to exploit the rules and shut out smaller bidders. Smaller license areas, free of package bidding rules, are equally accessible to everyone and produce much higher revenues. For instance, the B block generated $9.1 billion using CMAs, but the C block, with just 12 license areas, generated only $4.7 billion for nearly twice as much spectrum. In conclusion, U.S. Cellular strongly supports the committee's draft legislation and the FCC's plans to auction D block licenses. The proposed legislation charts the best course by funding public safety mobile broadband networks while promoting competition in the auction and in the market for wireless services. The FCC should expeditiously auction the D block using CMA or EA licenses and no package bidding. U.S. Cellular is prepared to bid on D block area licenses, pursue partnerships with public safety, and deploy advanced services to America's consumers and businesses. Thank you for the opportunity to provide this testimony, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hanley. Mr. Bazelon.
Thank you. It's an honor to speak here today. 2 years ago, I testified before this committee on the outcome of Auction 73, the 700 megahertz auction. At that time, I said, as for the pending decisions about the D block, the worst thing would be to leave it unused. Freeing it for unrestricted commercial use, configuring it as smaller geographic licenses, and then auctioning it would be best. This would have the benefit of adding more commercial spectrum under flexible license to the band, which would allow a portion of the significant unmet demand from Auction 73 to be met. This approach, of course, would require that the needs of public safety community be met through other means. My conclusions then still hold today. The D block should be auctioned for unrestricted commercial uses, and public safety's needs should be directly funded. Consequently, I congratulate the subcommittee on the draft of the Public Safety Broadband Act of 2010 for the significant progress it makes in getting the D block auctioned for commercial uses and directly addressing the issue of funding public safety networks. Forecasting spectrum license auction receipts is not for the faint of heart. Significant uncertainty about future wireless market conditions as well as details of licensing and auctioning rules requires that any forecasts of spectrum values and auction receipts have a wide confidence interval. Nevertheless, a good idea of spectrum values can be derived from observing recent sales and adjusting for quality differences and changing market conditions. By my estimates, a well-structured competitive auction of the D block could be expected to raise $3 billion to $4 billion in revenue. Such estimates assume a well-designed, unconstrained auction. Specifically, my calculations assume small licenses, no package bidding or open access obligations, and unrestricted entry in the auction. Dropping any of those assumptions would be expected to have a negative impact on auction revenues. I also want to say a brief word about the value of the discussion draft's auction of 25 megahertz of the 1675 to 1710 band paired with the 2155 to 2180 band. Without knowing the timing and costs of reallocating the federal users from the lower portion of the band, it is difficult to put a value on this pair of bands. Nevertheless, a reasonable initial estimate for the value of the spectrum identified in the discussion draft would be around $7.5 billion for 50 megahertz paired. Combined with the D block revenues, the discussion draft identifies approximately $11 billion in revenue from spectrum auctions. I'd also like to say a word about auctions of additional bands of spectrum. In addition to the two bands noted above, there are many more bands of radio spectrum that could potentially be licensed and auctioned. The National Broadband Plan identifies several bands, and there are others to consider as well. Decisions about specific allocations and pairing of spectrum bands should consider the full set of potential bands available for reallocation. Also, getting additional spectrum commercially licensed will benefit public safety in at least two ways. First, additional competition in the provision of mobile broadband services increases the potential partners for public safety, reducing costs and increasing the range of services that they can use. Second, a better connected public is a safer public. Just as the proliferation of cell phones supports public safety's mission, the increasing use of mobile broadband by the public will further enhance public safety community's ability to respond to future emergencies. Finally, as a former Congressional Budget Office analyst, I would like to comment briefly on the scoring of revenue to fund public safety infrastructure and operations. The scorable value of any directed spectrum auction is only the increase in value from the legislation over the baseline revenue estimates from the sale of the spectrum. Consequently, the roughly $11 billion in potential auction receipts identified in the discussion draft will likely have a score of a few $1 billion less. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bazelon. Mr. Fonts.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
And if you could pull that mic a little closer, we'll hear you better. Please be sure it's on.
There we go.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Stearns, members of this subcommittee. My name is Brian Fonts, and I'm CEO of the National Emergency Number Association, NENA. NENA represents more than 7,000 dedicated 911 and emergency communication professionals who receive and manage nearly 250 million 911 calls annually. NENA members are the first link in the emergency response chain that so many Americans rely on every day. I'd like to thank the House co-chairs of the Congressional E911 Caucus, both members of this commission or subcommittee, Representatives Eshoo and Representative Shimkus, for their commitment to advancing 911 and emergency communication systems, most recently by introducing the Next Generation 911 Preservation Act of 2010, which NENA fully supports. NENA thanks the subcommittee for holding today's hearings. It is fitting that the subcommittee is simultaneously addressing 911 legislation and a draft bill to provide for a nationwide wireless public safety broadband network. The public must be able to rely on effective 911 and emergency response systems, and in the broadband world, these two are joined. This requires the most technologically advanced 911 systems and access to high-speed wireless broadband networks for emergency responders. The two pieces of legislation the subcommittee is addressing today have substantial potential to improve our nation's 911 and emergency communications capabilities. Millions of 911 calls are made every year by citizens who are increasingly utilizing innovative forms of voice, video, data services. Yet today, most 911 centers are primarily limited to voice-only communications, and this is simply unacceptable. It is essential that we improve access to 911 for all Americans, especially for the deaf, hard of hearing, and individuals with speech disabilities who regularly communicate with non-traditional text, video, and instant messaging communication services, and who also expect that these services will be able to connect directly to 911. For all of these reasons and more, it must be a national priority to foster the migration from 20th century voice-centric 911 and emergency communications systems into a broadband-enabled IP emergency services model that embraces all voice, video, and data applications. The Next Generation 911 Preservation Act of 2010 will help foster this transition. This legislation builds upon and extends several elements in the Enhanced 911 Act of 2004 and will help accelerate the nationwide transition to next-generation 911 systems. While we support the legislation, there are a few minor modifications, and I assure you they are just minor, and we've already provided those recommendations to the staffs of the co-sponsors as well as the committee, and we look forward to working with the committee on that. Also, while the current bill as written would place the leadership of the National 911 Office within the National Telecommunication and Information Administration, as Representative Eshoo said, we are aware that the co-sponsors of the bill have discussed making this office a joint program office by adding the administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. This would essentially be a continuation of the current structure of the National 911 Office as established in the Enhanced 911 Act of 2004. NENA would support this modification to the bill, and we look forward to working with the committee staff, and we thank you for your interest in this legislation. Now, with respect to the discussion draft for the Public Safety Broadband Act of 2010, NENA has consistently encouraged the FCC and Congress to ensure that any actions taken provide at least the following. First, a public safety wireless broadband network or network of networks must be built nationwide. Second, funding for the nationwide wireless public safety broadband network, both on a construction or CapEx basis and maintenance OpEx basis, must be provided. The National Broadband Plan outlines several essential steps necessary to achieve a nationwide wireless public safety broadband network, including some issues that only Congress can address. First and foremost is the critical issue of funding, NENA's number one priority in this debate. NENA urges Congress to address the draft legislation's recommendations and to make near-term funding available for public safety broadband systems and to ensure that funds are available on a sustainable and annually recurring basis. Such action will ensure that broadband networks are built and maintained and effectively serving all areas of the country. With the release of the discussion draft this week, it is clear that you intend to do just that, to address public safety's broadband funding needs. We thank you for releasing this draft discussion item, and we hope that it will do just that, generate discussion, resulting in the establishment of a nationwide public safety broadband network and the funding to build and operate that network. We stand ready to work with you, the Commission, and our colleagues in public safety on this important issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fonts, and thanks to all of our witnesses for being with us this morning and sharing your views on this matter. Mr. Barnett, I'm going to begin my questioning with you. The public safety community at the present time holds 10 megahertz in the 700 block that has been designated for broadband communications. Your analysis shows that that holding is sufficient for the broadband network, and Mr. Dowd, Mr. Zipperstein, and others have recommended that additional spectrum be provided to public safety for that purpose, so that we can get an empirical sense of whether the 10 megahertz is sufficient. I wonder if you have any numbers that shows the number of first responder users per megahertz at 10 megahertz as compared to the number of commercial users in the commercial 700 megahertz spectrum holding, given the number of megahertz that is designated for commercial holders in the 700 megahertz block. So, I mean, simply stated, would there be more public safety users in their megahertage, or would there be more commercial users in the commercial block that is available? Do you happen to have those numbers?
You know, Mr. Chairman, I think what I can tell you is that per megahertz, the commercial networks cover vastly more users than will be used. There will be users in the public safety spectrum. So the way that we calculated it, and I think you may be referencing this in the capacity white paper, there are about 2 million users in public safety, or at least you could estimate that. There may be fewer at any particular time for the 10 megahertz, so that's where we're considering that there will be about 200,000 users per megahertz. Another way of looking at it, though, is on the commercial side, there's about 547 megahertz across all the spectrums. And so when you do the division on that, that's about 530,000 users per megahertz. When you compare that to the 97 megahertz that public safety has across all spectrums, that's only about 21,000. So in some ways, what you can think of this is that there are 25 times the number of users for commercial per megahertz than there are for in essence, public safety users.
And so your conclusion from that is that public safety would have ample megahertage available with 10 megahertz devoted to broadband.
Absolutely, for day-to-day and for most emergencies. And as we mentioned, you can design scenarios where they'll really stress any system that I would design, any system that Chief Dow would design. But that's why we did have the ability to roam over with priority access.
Okay. Chief Dowd or Mr. Zipperstein, do you want to make any comment with regard to those numbers?
Well, I guess my comment, Mr. Boucher, would be, what relevance does it have to public safety? Public safety systems are used very differently than commercial systems. We use our radio systems in a way that, quite frankly, if you're going to compare it to commercial usage, is very inefficient. But you have to look at the criticality of the systems and what we're doing on them and what has to happen on them. You know, the FCC has issued a white paper. You know, it only came out 48 hours ago, so we really haven't had a chance to go into it in depth. But the City of New York filed a white paper back in February with the FCC, and, you know, as public safety experts, and having already built a broadband system in the City of New York and utilized some of the information from throughput information from that system, we came to the conclusion clearly that 10 megahertz of spectrum is simply not enough for public safety in any emergency, and that's not just in a large-scale place, but in.
Thank you. My time is limited. I think we have the sense of your answer.
Okay, thank you,
Mr. Zipperstein. I'll give you an opportunity very briefly if you want to add to that.
I would simply say that commercial networks are more efficient, but I completely agree with Chief Dowd that the average commercial user is using far less bandwidth than would the average public safety user in a broadband environment. AT&T has had very well publicized problems with its network in San Francisco and New York as a result of very high bandwidth users. And in the public safety world,
well, that's in the 3G network, and you know we're emerging into the era of 4G and LTE technology now, which is the standard for public safety. Also,
that's right.
We're really talking about a whole other generation of.
That's right, Mr. Chairman.
Let me come to another question. My time is limited. Public safety now has 10 megahertz dedicated to broadband. It has 12 megahertz dedicated to narrowband. All of that's in the 700 block. It has 2 megahertz used as guard bands to protect from interference for a total of 24 megahertz. The 24 megahertz are all contiguous. So if, in fact, more megahertz than the 10 assigned for broadband is needed for broadband, why not aggregate at least 22 out of the 24, leaving a couple for guarding, and simply have the voice function be delivered over VoIP, a data standard, which LTE is. And why would that not be a satisfactory means of providing more spectrum if, in fact, public safety feels like it needs it? Mr. Dowd, do you want to comment?
Sure. Well, you know, the problem with that is that, you know, that plan was established several years ago, and that spectrum was dedicated, at this time at least, for land mobile radio systems, narrowband systems, which, by the way, you know, is a mandate that exists from the FCC as far as certain agencies like the NYPD have.
Well, let me just interject. We're looking at a 10-year time horizon to achieve all of this.
Right.
And within that 10-year horizon, why could you not migrate the narrowband offerings that you have on that 12 megahertz at the present time to broadband if, in fact, you need more megahertz for the broadband?
Well, because the answer is we need it now. You know, so we're looking at building a broadband network and an effective broadband network that has enough capacity to do what we need to do as we go into that new technology. And these are things that, you know, information that we've shared before. So, you know, if you're telling us to wait 10 years for that spectrum, you know, our answer is we really can't. Maybe somebody else can wait 10 years, maybe the commercial side, if that ultimately becomes available because you know, everybody ultimately migrates from land mobile radio to broadband technology.
Here's the other part of that question, though. Why could you not, even immediately, with the 10 megahertz that you have, deploy your broadband technology and then use VoIP as the means of offering the narrowband voice service over the broadband technology? So you're using LTE data standard. You would use that for voice, video, and data, using the voice as a VoIP application. Why could you not do that?
Well, because these things have not been perfected as mission critical capabilities. So when
you're saying VoIP is not.
Yes.
You think VoIP is not sufficient for the kind of voice service you would need?
Not at this point, no.
All right, Mr. Barrett, do you have any comment?
Yes, sir. We do need to look over the horizon, and I think that's what the concept of being flexible on the use of the narrowband. There are not many that are built out in narrowband part of the 700 megahertz spectrum right now. We even got a letter from a chief of police, Chief Sult in Sandy Springs, Georgia, asking whether or not they might be able to do just that. So we do need to look at for the near term and for that 10-year horizon. Whether or not public safety, at its choice, at its option, could use some of that spectrum, and we're thinking about how to pursue that.
All right, thank you very much. My time has expired. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns, is recognized for his questions. Mr. Stearns has reminded me, we have a series of recorded votes pending on the floor of the House, 3 votes in total. This will consume the better part of 15 to 20 minutes for us, and so we will ask your indulgence while we respond to those votes, and we will be back as soon as we can.
Nice to have a chance to stand up.
Yep, I need a restroom. All right. Hey, Dale, how are you? Hi, John. I think that's going to be an issue.
It's short of rain out there, so I'm sure you're welcome to that. It's been a long time. Then you don't have any in July.
Hi, Jill. Long time no see. And you're going back?
Yeah, tomorrow, as a matter of fact.
What are you going to be doing there?
Just hanging out. I'm taking a little time off. I got about a month and a half of vacation that I'm just saying I'm going to go to a writer's program, and then I'll come back and see,
Will you be in Consumer Bureau? Consumer?
Yeah, probably state outreach.
It's not that you're crazy.
Oh, good.
It's not that you're crazy.
Well, hopefully it will be a better environment than it was last time you were there.
That's true.
I think that'll happen.
How long are you free? We're going to be here for about 20 minutes, and then we'll come back. Do you want me to go down and get some before you leave?
No, I'm fine.
Okay, good.
I'm fine, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Well, I'm gonna chat a little bit.
You betcha.
Good. How are you?
Are you?
Okay. How are you? So we don't know. How are you, sir? Good.
I wasn't on that conversation. I certainly did.
That really hurt me. Well, I mean, I think it was indirect transparency. Hey. Wanted to learn forever. Nice to meet you.
My hands are clean.
Oh. Don't feed the evil beast.
I know it wasn't me. I felt that.
I have a process for that. Thank you.
All right, I'm
right
sorry.
there in the little book. I remember what a viciously hot day it was. Very appreciate that. There's another place that I think yes. Very active. No, not at all. I mean, I think. Yeah, we activated the voting system. Should be implanted in right now. Absolutely. Yes. And you know that's how it comes out. I mean, I like the way you put it there. That was part of the reason why it's splashed all over. Yeah, very subtle. Maybe that's the right way for the coalition. I don't know about that. We talked about it. I don't know. But in this particular discussion, yeah, they wanted to try to keep it. Well, to dominate the discussion and splash it all over the. You don't want it to dominate the discussion. Well, they're trying to emphasize Right. The more you participate, the less Very quick. You got both. I actually thought most of the statements were pretty good. Member statements.
Oh, I remember.
All right. It's much brighter. Yeah, they started turning on. We were in here before they turned the lights on. It was a little dim, but boy, then it went like. Very.
I know why.
And I would ask the witnesses if they could resume their places at the table. When we recessed, my questions had been posed to our witnesses, and I'm pleased to recognize now the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns, for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If anybody didn't completely answer your question, I'd be glad to allow you any extra time, because I think you had some very good questions. So is anything that has to be resolved on your questions?
Well, thank you, Mr. Stearns. I guess at the moment it's just the two of us, and so we're not impinging on anyone else's time except our witnesses. I do have one other question that I'll just take this opportunity to pose. Admiral Barnett, in your recommendations, you had talked about priority access being provided to first responders over some additional 700 megahertz spectrums. And I wonder if you could be a little more specific about where else you would see that priority access pertaining. In other words, what other 700 megahertz spectrum would that apply to, and whose hands would that be? And what does priority access actually mean? How would that work in practice? What are the circumstances under which it would apply? And how would you see that impacting the commercial use of the spectrum to which it applies?
Right. Mr. Chairman, let me say first, some of the things that you're asking about still need to be worked out, and we will be the subject for rulemaking, where we'll get input from public safety and from industry as well. Certainly we look at priority access and roaming onto the D block. We would think that would need to be something that would be a condition on the sale of the D block, as well as creating devices that would see both the D block and the public safety spectrum. And we'd also see, and we've looked at how this would happen, is roaming over onto, in essence, what is Verizon and AT&T and other carriers in the 700 megahertz, so that, in essence, public safety would have its choice. It could contract with the D-block licensee for roaming and priority access. It can contract with all of them for that. It's basically try and provide as much choice as possible.
That would be on a contractual basis?
Yes, sir. And the way that this works is that there would also be we would expect compensation. The carriers would be compensated for it. We would think that would need to be at the most favored customer level, and it's why we do think that that there needs to be a look at how the cost of operating the network will be very important.
But just to clarify, you're proposing that on a purely voluntary basis, not a mandatory basis?
It would be mandatory on the carrier if public safety wants to contract with that particular carrier. That's the way that we're looking at it, so that it becomes public safety's choice on that. If public safety wants to contract with them, then the carrier would need to provide that.
And the terms of the contract would specify the compensation that would be provided and possibly other terms of service?
Yes, sir.
But there would be no choice but to enter into the contract.
Yes, sir. That would be a requirement on them, and we think that that's reasonable. Now, one of the things that LTE will offer is 15 levels of priority service. And so the things that, and it's not the old circuit switch technology. This is, as soon as public safety accesses the network, the packets begin to flow, and they get first-in-line privileges. The same would be true for 911 calls. And so it's not that you're cutting off any calls. It's all the rest of the network at that point. So, my kids or something like that playing video games, that performance goes down, so that the performance of the public safety calls and the 911 calls would go up.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Stearns. You're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I request unanimous consent to submit for the record the letter that 16 members of this committee from both sides of the aisle sent to the FCC in June 2007, warning that harmful conditions would hurt the 700 megahertz auction, a prediction that came true.
Without objection.
This is a question for Mr. Bazelon and Mr. Zipperstein. I know your list is your first choice, auctioning off the D block and funding the public safety network through the proceeds. There's been lots of talk by the FCC about net neutrality, imposing that. If that was implemented by the FCC as part of the auction and other conditions, would that reduce the proceeds of the auction? Mr. Zipperstein first.
Yes, I think it's
put your mic on.
Yes, it's fair to say that any time spectrum is encumbered with conditions that the likely revenue to be gained by the Treasury will be lower than spectrum auctioned free and clear of any conditions.
And the conditions besides network neutrality, what other conditions do you think which would be harmful?
Well, for example, in the first attempt to auction the D block back in 2008, there were a number of conditions that had nothing to do with network neutrality, conditions on the winner in terms of building a public safety network and those sorts of things. And we had over 250 rounds of bidding in that auction. There was only one bid for the D block, and it was less than half of the reserve price.
Mr. Bazelon?
I agree that in general, when you reduce the returns to an investment, the investment's worth less. And if net neutrality regulations are applied to the wireless sector and it reduces the returns to the network operators, they're going to pay less for the spectrum, for the privilege in the first place.
Okay. Mr. Barnett, is there any comments you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, Mr. Stearns, I'm not your expert on auctions and their proceeds. The main thing that I think we focus is on my particular is on the interoperability, making sure that it's nationwide.
Okay. Admiral Barnett and Mr. Hatfield, if we auction the D block rather than allocate it to public safety, how much faster and how much more cheaply can we deploy interoperable broadband public safety networks that cover the entire country?
Make sure I understood your question was
if we auction the D block rather than just allocate it to public safety, it's a question of cost and deployment. How much faster and how much more cheaply can we deploy this public safety network across the country?
I'm not sure I can quantify it for you, but I do think we're at a unique period of time here where the commercial networks are building out their LTE networks, and if we can piggyback on that and build at the same time, I think there's substantial economies. I'm not sure I can quantify it for you.
Admiral?
And I would just add to that, if the D block is reallocated, it really destroys the commercial markets for the equipment. It makes the network more expensive to build and for public safety to operate it and get their own devices. And for that reason, we think that it would really be destructive of both a nationwide system and of an interoperable system.
This is a question for the entire panel. I was asking the staff, is there any country that has deployed through the broadband this type of interoperable broadband public safety network? And to our knowledge, there's no one has done it. Does anyone on the panel know of any country that has done it? Okay.
Not aware of anyone that is certainly not in 4G.
Not in 4, but maybe in less than 4G.
Well, there are countries that have national police forces that have the advantage of having interoperable networks. I'm not positive that those have made the leap to broadband yet. I don't know that.
Okay. Well, I thought that was interesting, that the fact that no one else has done it, so it's possible we'd be the first. Chief Dow, we appreciate your being here and everything you're doing. I have not talked to Peter King about his bill. I shall do that. I think the question that perhaps I would have, because I think we all share the same goal, and I thank you for your opening statement. The problem is that legislation providing for direct grant of the spectrum, it appears, is not likely to make it. When we mark up this bill, that's not what we're looking at. Mr. King, probably both Mr. Boucher and I should probably talk to him to see if there's any way we could discuss further the dimensions of his bill. But if you and your illustrious peers decide that this is not the right way to go, it'd be unfortunate because we'd like your support. So I guess in a larger sense, if you make a position that you're not supporting, which I think the majority, perhaps on this panel and in this subcommittee, then that would not be good. So I guess I'm reaching out to you that you might want to think about a fallback position so that we all move together here on a bipartisan fashion. And have you perhaps any ideas, perhaps realizing that we'd like your support?
Well,
It's probably an observation rather than a question.
Yeah, it's, but let me see if I can respond to that. And, we've studied this from every different angle. And knowing, and when we look at the FCC's plan, and we've only looked at it, superficially so far, because again, it's only been out for 48 hours. But one of the things we keep hearing, I think, here from a public safety perspective is the notion or the concern that, by doing this, we're preventing public safety from having, a broadband network. And our contention is that by doing what we're doing, we're establishing the necessary requirements to build a viable public safety network. You can't be in a situation where you're constantly comparing, and I keep hearing this, constantly comparing usage on the different types of networks, commercial compared to public safety, and say that those comparisons somehow invalidate public safety's need. They simply don't. Commercial networks are built as for-profit networks. They try to maximize usage of the spectrum. Now, we have already, on a number of occasions, presented alternatives to members of this committee and to the FCC specifically that we feel would be far more efficient than our normal usage of spectrum. In the broadband technology, those capabilities clearly are there, and we have discussed those and described those. And we're open to those flexibilities. Some of the flexibilities we see in your bill, we are supportive of. But, we just, at the core of it, can't get past the point that 10 megahertz of spectrum is just not going to be sufficient for our needs on an emergency basis, and for that guaranteed delivery of information that we have to have, which is different from the philosophy in commercial networks. And if I could just very quickly, our position has and always will be that, we cannot rely on commercial networks for mission critical work. Every experience we've ever had tells us that those systems will fail before our system were to fail. So we just don't see that as a realistic alternative.
So in your likelihood, what happens is if we followed your path, then you had this spectrum, then you would rent it out, and what do you feel the next step would be?
Well, again, in trying to come up with solutions that we believe will be efficient, but also accomplish the primary mission. Don't forget, the first and foremost mission of this is to be a viable public safety communications network. So we're looking to do, not just data and video and all that stuff. We also want to do voice on this. We want to migrate into this highly efficient technology, but always at the level of service that we would require. Would we allow for, or do we think the idea or the flexibility of allowing for leasing on a secondary basis, and as Jamie just mentioned, there's an LTE that will be 15 levels of priority. Could you allow for usage on a commercial basis to offset costs of the public safety network? Sure, you could. We've already talked to utilities that are very attracted to the idea because they would love to be on a system that's more hardened than the commercial networks, which could give them on a secondary basis access to a public safety network in an emergency. I'll give you a quick example of it. Recently in New York City, we had a tremendous weather storm, which was like a hurricane.
My time has expired, so
okay.
I appreciate it. I guess the question would be, where are you going to get the money to even do the initial construct afterwards? But my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stearns. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, first of all, let me ask unanimous consent that 2 letters from the National Governors Association not in support of the auction, that they be admitted into the record.
Without objection.
All right. Mr. Chairman, I really do feel like I'm swimming upstream. It kind of, this situation, I've heard and listened to all the testimony, this situation kind of reminds me of a time when I think I was in the 5th grade, and we had of course, and my teachers at the time were very enthusiastic about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and how everybody was equal, and equality was the subject. And So I was full of it, and I went home, and my mother asked me to do something, and we got in a little spat. And I told my mother, I said, well, Mom, I don't know, I'm equal. I have an equal status in this household. And she said, yes, you do. And she said, but I'm more equal than you. Okay? So I'm kind of chiefed out. There's a lot of equality and everybody's opinion is respected here. But I have to say that you're a little bit more equal than the others, simply because you have the experience, and we're looking to you to ensure that if in whatever kind of crisis that we might be faced with the American people, that you have the sufficient resources and equipment that make sure that the emergency, that condition, that you're able to manipulate it and control it and to keep as many Americans alive as you possibly can. So to me, you're a little more equal than the rest of than other panelists. And I just got to ask you just a couple of questions here. I understand that the state of New York had to pay a fee to roam on a commercial carrier's network. Is that true that you pay roaming fees in New York?
Are we currently paying roaming fees?
Right, yes.
Well, we're paying fees for commercial services on broadband right now, yeah.
Would you support imposing a condition on D-Block spectrum prohibiting roaming fee charges to first responders?
Well, again, the logic of it to us is, if we're going to build our own systems, then why would we also want to pay for broadband services, especially on networks that we're deeply reluctant to rely on. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us.
All right. I understand that the FCC and it's been testified that about the 48-hour release of their white paper, concluding that 10 megahertz of broadband safety spectrum is sufficient for day-to-day operation. Yet I do have an FCC document filed by Motorola that shows something to the contrary. And Mr. Chairman, I want to ask unanimous consent that this document be entered into the record also.
Without objection.
Chief Dow, do you agree that with the FCC that 10 megahertz is sufficient for day-to-day operation?
No, we don't. And we base that on our analysis of it with the white paper that we submitted to the FCC, which shows actual usage and estimates of usage of broadband capabilities in the future, which clearly show us, at concentrated incidents which happen on a regular basis, and some of them high profile, and you hear about them like plane crashes and such, and others that you don't hear about that happen every day. And our analysis clearly indicates to us that, that 10 is simply not going to be enough. Just because there's a situation in Times Square where there's a very high profile incident where there's an explosive device doesn't mean that we don't respond to those types of things every day. And you know what? Thankfully, most of them turn out to be nothing. An unattended bag in the subway system, it ends up being somebody's dirty laundry. But you don't know that until you take all the steps necessary to determine that. And to do that, you need the communications capabilities to make those determinations.
The only issue of priority access, it merely puts public safety at the head of the line, but does not guarantee. Now, that's important to me. Does not guarantee that they can get on a system that is already clogged with consumer traffic. A situation that routinely occurs at the scene of a lot of emergencies across the country. And I guess this issue has been addressed with a preemption clause, and preemption would guarantee that access will require kicking consumers off the network in order for first responders to get access to the network. Do you support preempting consumer use to guarantee public safety access? And how would that work? And how viable is that?
Well, that's the problem with the viability, because there's a couple of issues there. Number one is, clearly you're correct in our view in public safety that you need preemptive access to the spectrum. Next in line or first in queue, or is not sufficient for us to do the work that we have to do. But the problem is that again, commercial systems are not built to the same standards that public safety communications are built to. They don't have the same survivability, the same backups, the same redundancies. It's cost prohibitive for them, and we understand that. They're in business to make money. We don't build that way. We build to a very different standard. So the problem is that even if you had preemptive access on commercial systems, it doesn't mean that the system is going to be viable. And our experience is that if our systems get strained or our systems become overwhelmed or start to run into difficulties, that's already happened to the commercial systems. Ours survive longer than theirs do.
Maybe Mr. Barnett, maybe you can answer this question for me. If commercial carriers are unable to provide priority access because the systems are overloaded, who is liable if the system is not available when the public safety operatives need it the most? Who's liable? Who assumes the liability for that?
I'm not positive that I can address your liability question on that, but that is why we designed our proposal so that public safety would have the core 10 megahertz. Nobody else can use that. They can manage that spectrum however they want to. So the key question here is, and where Chief Dowd and I have a slight disagreement, he would tell you that 10 megahertz is not enough, and I would tell you on some days, on those bad emergency days, 20 megahertz is not going to be enough. They're going to need to be able to roam over. And that's exactly why I cited the outage of the public safety voice system in the District of Columbia. They were out of business because they couldn't roam over onto other networks. And if those networks had been available and the FCC plan had been available to them, they could have roamed over to 1, 2, 3, 4, any other networks. It's a tremendous amount of redundancy that reallocating the D block alone does not provide.
Well, maybe Mr. Hatfield could... I got one more question, Mr.
Okay, Mr. Rush, we have a series of votes pending.
Yeah, I got just one more question, and this is a very simple question. Mr. Hatfield, in your opinion, is 10 megahertz enough for public safety officials?
If I can answer your question in this way, the advantage of cellular networks compared with when I started out in this business, the public safety networks and the mobile telephone networks at the time use a very powerful transmitter that covered a whole area. Therefore, one conversation, there was only 200,000 subscribers in the country at that time. And the reason you couldn't have many more, one of the major reasons is that one conversation would take up the spectrum in a whole region. The whole notion of the cellular concept is that you shorten up the range of each transmission so that, for example, a conversation here in this room could be used, that same frequency could be used over at the Capitol building and over on the Senate side. That same spectrum can be reused over and over. So a lot of this debate that you're hearing here concerns how much we reuse the spectrum. And so is it enough? I mean, just having the size of a cell quadruples the capacity. So this is in some ways you see an economic issue. In other words, you take New York City, if they need more capacity, you do exactly what the cellular carriers have done, and that is to divide their geographic areas more finely. And I believe it's correct that the FCC studies show that the amount of frequency reuse being proposed and being used in traditional public safety is much, much less than what the commercial users provide. So to me, Congress here has sort of a trade-off here. If you can get more capacity for a public safety system by making it look more commercial with more sites, or you can say, no, we'll just hand you the spectrum without paying for it. And that's basically the trade-off. That's basically the trade-off that's going on here. To go back to your question, you can get more spectrum by dividing the cells down, cutting it in half, roughly speaking, quadruples the amount of capacity.
Mr. Rush, thank you very much. Thanks to all of our witnesses. We appreciate your attendance here this morning. This has been a highly informative session, certainly for me. I think the other members would say the same. And we may actually have some follow-up questions that we want to propound to you. So without objection, the record of this hearing is going to remain open for a period of 2 weeks while members propound to you questions. When you get those, if you could answer them expeditiously, we would appreciate that. So thanks for your attendance today, and this hearing stands adjourned.
Guess I'm not